There are fundamental rules to submarine warfare. Rule 1, stay hidden. Rule 2, never reveal your position. Rule 3, a submarine's weapon is the torpedo. In the summer of 1945, Commander Eugene Fluckey and the crew of the USS Barb broke every single one of them in a single night. This is a military investigation into a mission that shouldn't have been possible in operation so far outside the rulebook. It reads like fiction. But the smoking wreckage it left behind was terrifyingly real. The night of July 22, 1945. Imagine, if you can, the skin of the Pacific Ocean pulled taut and black like polished obsidian. Now, imagine a crack in that surface. A long, dark shape rising from the depths, shedding water in whispering cascades. This is the USS Barb, a Gato-class submarine, and she's breathing. After days spent in the crushing silence of the deep, the air on the open bridge tastes like freedom, a raw, cold, salt-laced draft of life. But they are not in friendly waters. They are ghosts, haunting a place no American submarine was ever designed to be less than 1,000 yards off the coast of Karafuto, a long finger of Japanese territory north of Hokkaido. On the bridge, four figures stand silhouetted against a canopy of indifferent stars. One of them is Commander Eugene Fluckey. Lucky Fluckey. The name fit. He'd already earned a Medal of Honor and 4 Navy Crosses, and he'd turned the Barb from a simple predator of the seas into something else. His boat was the first to ever fire rockets from its deck, turning a silent hunter into a submerged artillery platform. They had terrorized coastal towns, factories, anything within range. But tonight, Fluckey wasn't watching the towns. He wasn't even watching the sea lanes for the fat merchant ships they called Maris. He was staring, with an unnerving intensity, at the land itself. His executive officer, Lieutenant Commander Bill Wright, followed his gaze. "Skipper? See something?" Wright's voice was a low rumble, barely disturbing the quiet hum of the diesel engines charging the batteries below. For a long moment, Fluckey didn't answer. He just raised his binoculars, the lenses ghostly pale in the starlight. He was tracing a thin, faint line that ran parallel to the dark coast. A scar on the land. And then, far to the south, a pinprick of light appeared, growing steadily brighter. It was accompanied by a sound, a faint rhythmic clack-clack-clack that carried impossibly far over the still water. A train. A 16-car steam train, pulling its weight through the darkness, a vital artery pumping supplies to the Japanese war machine. It was a perfect target, but it was a land target. Utterly, completely, untouchably on land. The officers watched as the train chugged past, its silhouette a moving shadow against the deeper shadows of the hills. The rockets, Fluckey knew, were a bludgeon. Inaccurate. They might damage the track, but the Japanese would have it repaired in hours. You don't win a war by annoying the enemy. You win by severing their limbs. The train disappeared into the northern darkness. The sound faded, leaving only the whisper of the waves against the Barb's hull. The silence stretched. Fluckey lowered his binoculars, a strange, predatory gleam in his eyes. He turned to his officers, the men who trusted him, who had followed him through hell and back. "Gentlemen," he said, his voice quiet but carrying the weight of an anchor dropping into the abyss. "We're going to blow up that train." Wright blinked. The engineering officer, Lieutenant Matt Matthews, shifted his weight. It was a statement of such profound absurdity that it took a moment to even process. It was like a pilot saying he was going to lasso a battleship. "With the rockets, Skipper?" Wright asked, trying to ground the conversation in some version of reality. Fluckey shook his head slowly. "No, not with rockets." He pointed a single, steady finger at the dark shoreline. "With a shore party. We're going to put our men on Japanese soil." And there it was. The anomaly. The moment the world tilted on its axis. Submariners do not go on land. The submarine is their universe, their fortress, their sanctuary, their weapon. The sea is their element, the land is a death sentence. To leave the boat, to willingly set foot on enemy territory, miles from the safety of the deep, it wasn't just against doctrine. It was against nature. It was a violation of the fundamental laws that kept them alive. The bridge went utterly silent. The only sound was the sea, whispering against the hull, as if it, too, was shocked by the heresy that had just been spoken. The plan wasn't just a plan, it was a ghost on the radio, a lie on the map, a madness born in the quiet of a Pacific night. How do you command a fish to climb a tree? And more importantly, How do you ask men of the deep, sailors to their very bones, to become soldiers for a single night and wage a war on the one place they are most vulnerable? For a solid minute, the three officers on the bridge with Fluckey simply stared at him, caught in the undertow of his words. It was Bill Wright, the ever-practical executive officer, who broke the spell. He was the ship's anchor, the man whose job was to translate the skipper's vision, or in this case, his madness, into the cold, hard calculus of risk and survival. "Skipper, with all due respect, that's impossible," Wright said, his voice a low, careful rumble. "We're submariners. We don't have marines. We don't have landing craft. We have rubber rafts. We don't have ground intelligence, no idea about shore patrols, guard posts, or tripwires. If we put men ashore and they get captured," he let the sentence hang in the cold night air, the unspoken horrors of what the Japanese did to prisoners, especially commandos, filling the silence. "And what's the signal? What's the timeline? If they're a minute late, what do? We can't linger. A destroyer patrol comes over that horizon and we have to dive. We'd be forced to leave them, Gene. We'd have to leave our own men behind to die on that beach." This was the official explanation, the doctrine, the absolute, unshakable truth of their world. Imagine a deep-sea diver whose entire existence is defined by his heavy bronze helmet, his weighted boots, and the precious airline connecting him back to the surface. He lives, breathes, and fights in that suit. It is his reality. And now imagine his commander telling him to take off the helmet and go for a walk. That was what Fluckey had just proposed. He was asking his men to abandon the very thing that kept them alive, to step out of their armor in the middle of a sword fight. It was a categorical error, a fundamental misunderstanding of what a submarine was. It was a weapon of the sea, a steel shark. It was not an infantry transport. Fluckey listened patiently, his gaze never leaving the dark line of the coast. He'd anticipated every one of Wright's objections. He knew the doctrine because he had mastered it. Now, he was ready to break it. "Let's go to the wardroom," he said quietly. Down below, in the cramped, warm heart of the Barb, the atmosphere changed. Under the glow of a single shaded lamp, Fluckey unrolled not a nautical chart of the sea, but a detailed hydrographic map of the coastline. He was treating the land like an uncharted reef, a problem to be solved with navigation and precision. "You're right, Bill," Fluckey began, his finger tracing the thin blue line of the coast. "We're not Marines, so we won't act like them. A Marine assault is loud. This will be silent. We go ashore after the last train, and we're back aboard before the first." He looked up, his eyes scanning the faces of his officers. Wright, the skeptic Matthews, the engineer who had to make the impossible work, and his third officer, who just watched in stunned silence. "You talk about intelligence. Well, we have some. We've been watching this coast for 2 days. We know their patrol boats are predictable. But more than that," he paused, letting the weight of his next words settle. "Their greatest defense is their certainty. They know a submarine cannot attack the land. They know it the same way you do. They will not be looking for us there. Their arrogance is our intelligence." This was the contradiction. Fluckey wasn't denying the official reality, he was using his enemy's belief in it as a weapon against them. He was turning the rules of the game inside out. The very absurdity that made his own officers balk was the core of his strategy. The official explanation was that the Barb was the wrong tool for the job. But Fluckey's quiet, relentless logic began to present a new, unsettling truth. Perhaps the Barb wasn't the wrong tool. Perhaps it was the only tool that could possibly work, precisely because no one would ever see it coming. Fluckey leaned over the map, the light catching the sharp lines of his face. He was no longer just a commander, he was an investigator, building his case, laying out the evidence for the impossible crime he intended to commit. The room was silent, the hum of the submarine's machinery a steady heartbeat beneath them. "Gentlemen," he said, his voice low and intense, "the war is ending. We all know it. The B-29s are burning their cities to the ground. But the Japanese High Command believes their home islands are impenetrable. They believe their coasts are fortresses. Their entire strategy, their will to fight on, is built on the myth of their own invincibility at home." He used his finger to draw a circle around their position, a tiny pinprick on the vast map of the Japanese Empire. Imagine you are a Japanese general in Tokyo. You receive a report. A vital supply train in Karafuto has been destroyed. Your first thought is an air raid, but there were no bombers. Sabotage, perhaps, but there's no known resistance on the island. Then, days later, the truth filters in. The impossible truth. An American submarine landed men on your soil, planted a bomb, and vanished without a trace. This was the War College briefing. Fluckey was explaining the concept of psychological warfare not as a textbook theory, but as a ghost story. It's not about the train, he continued, his eyes burning with conviction. It tells that general that nowhere is safe, that the black water of the Pacific itself can reach out and touch him. It plants a seed of doubt, a fear that if a submarine can land commandos 1,000 yards from their coast, what's to stop them from doing it in Sagami Bay? Or even Tokyo itself? We will be a ghost in their machine. The rumor that haunts their every coastal defense meeting. The destruction of the train was the mission. The destruction of Japanese certainty was the objective. Suddenly, the risk to 8 men felt balanced against a strategic prize of immense value. This wasn't just a raid, it was a message, delivered personally to the Emperor's doorstep. The ticking clock wasn't just about getting the men back before the next patrol. It was about the handful of weeks, maybe months, left in the war. Every blow they could land now, every crack they could put in the enemy's morale, might save thousands of American lives in the eventual, bloody invasion everyone knew was coming. The crew was assembled in the forward torpedo room. 80 men crammed into a space designed for 20, the air thick with the smell of diesel, sweat, and ozone. They sat on the bunks, on the deck plates, perched on the massive, sleeping torpedoes themselves. Fluckey stood before them, laid out the plan, and made the stakes clear. He told them of the risks. He told them they would be on their own. He told them the Barb would not wait for them if it meant the loss of the ship. And then he asked his question. "I need 8 volunteers," he said, his voice echoing in the steel tube. "No one is obligated. Step forward if you're in." For a heartbeat, there was nothing but the hum of the boat. Then, a man stood up. Then another. And another. Within a minute, the entire crew was on its feet. Every single one of the 80 men had volunteered to walk into the jaws of the dragon. The mission was no longer an officer's wild idea discussed in the sterile quiet of the wardroom. It was real now. It had a soul. It had 80 souls, all willing to risk everything for it. Fluckey looked at the sea of determined faces. His gamble had paid off. The men weren't just following orders they believed. Now came the hard part. The process of selection was less a military briefing and more a strange, desperate casting call. It began back in the wardroom, a rapid-fire scene of problem-solving. Fluckey stabbed a finger at the map where the shoreline met a dark patch of woods. "I need a ghost," he said. "Someone who can read the land in the dark. Someone who won't get lost." Right? Still skeptical but committed to the process, conceded. Lieutenant Bill Hatfield. He's an Eagle Scout. Grew up in the woods of the Pacific Northwest. On this boat, it's trivia. Out there, he gestured towards the map. He's the only man for the job. Perfect, Fluckey shot back. He leads. Now, the demolition charge. It's custom built, 55 pounds. I need steady hands to arm it, and I need a strong back to carry it. Matthews, the engineering officer, chimed in. For the hands, Paul Saunders. The signalman. He's quiet, meticulous. You want him on the detonator. For the muscle, Newland, the ship's cook. He's built like an ox. Good, Fluckey nodded, his mind already racing ahead. But who knows railways? Who knows where to put the charge for maximum effect? We can't just break the track, we have to vaporize it. A young ensign, who had been silent until now, spoke up. Skipper, what about Billy Hatfield? In the engine room. No relation to the lieutenant. I overheard him talking last week. Said he worked 5 years on the Union Pacific line before the war. Knows tracks, switches, culverts, everything. A slow grin spread across Fluckey's face. It was the final piece of the human puzzle. Get him, he commanded. The team wasn't just being chosen, it was being forged, specialist by specialist, from the hidden, dormant talents of his crew, excavated for one critical night. The first clue, the key to the entire operation, wasn't a captured document or a decoded message, it was the realization that the resources needed to solve this impossible problem were sleeping in the bunks of the USS Barb all along. In the final hours before the operation, the chosen 8 gathered in the forward torpedo room. This time, it wasn't a meeting, it was a workshop. Under the dim lights, surrounded by the sleek, deadly forms of the Mark 14 torpedoes, Billy Hatfield and Paul Saunders rehearsed the arming of the bomb. They did it blindfolded, over and over, their hands moving with a dancer's precision, connecting the wires, setting the pressure switch, feeling for the clicks and catches that meant the difference between success and catastrophic failure. Lieutenant Hatfield drilled the others with hand signals, a silent language they would use to communicate in the suffocating darkness of the Japanese coast. There was a palpable sense of excitement, of being on the cusp of something historic. The fog of war, for a moment, seemed to lift. They had a team. They had a plan. They had a weapon. The mystery of how to attack the land had been solved. But as they practiced their silent tasks, the submarine itself began to move. The thrum of the diesel engines gave way to the hum of the electric motors. The order was given: rig for silent running. Rig for red. The bright lights of the workshop flickered out, replaced by a deep, bloody crimson that bathed the torpedo room in an eerie glow. The Barb was beginning its final, slow, submerged approach to the coast. It was moving from the relative safety of the open ocean into the shallow, treacherous waters of the enemy's doorstep. And as the sub slipped beneath the waves, a new sound began to echo through the hull, a sound that every submariner dreads. A rhythmic, insistent ping ping ping. It was the unmistakable pulse of active sonar. Someone was out there, hunting in the dark. The sonar ping was a physical blow. In the silent, pressurized world of a submerged submarine, it was the sound of a giant tapping on the hull with a steel hammer, a brutal announcement: I see you. The hopeful atmosphere in the forward torpedo room evaporated, replaced by the cold, metallic taste of fear. The confident plans, the blindfolded practice, the quiet optimism, it all shattered against that single, repeating electronic pulse. Every man on the boat froze. Training took over. Men moved to their stations with the fluid, silent economy of a predator. Commander Fluckey was in the conning tower, his body pressed against the periscope housing, his eyes closed as if in prayer. He wasn't praying. He was listening, using the entire submarine as an extension of his own senses. The pings were coming from the south, rhythmic and steady. A patrol, probably a small destroyer escort, a kaiboken, the kind of vessel the Japanese used for coastal defense. They were cheap, mass-produced, and bristling with depth charges. They were submarine killers. The first, promising lead, the idea that the Japanese were arrogant and wouldn't be looking for them, was turning out to be a fatal miscalculation. It was a dead end. Worse, it was a trap. The enemy wasn't complacent, they were actively sweeping the coastline. The beautiful, simple theory that their mission's absurdity would be its best defense had just collided with the brutal reality of an enemy warship doing its job. They weren't ghosts slipping through a forgotten back door. They were rats caught in the beam of a flashlight. Bearing? Fluckey's voice was a whisper, a ghost in the machine. Bearing 170, Skipper, came the reply from the sonar man, his own voice tight with tension. Range 8,000 yards. Closing 8,000 yards. Less than 4 nautical miles. To a submarine trying to hide in shallow coastal water, it was point-blank range. The Barb was in a terrible position. To the east was the open sea and deeper water, but fleeing that way would mean abandoning the mission entirely. To the west was the shoreline, the water becoming dangerously shallow. It was a cage, and the door was swinging shut. The pinging grew louder, more insistent. It was a conversation you were forced to overhear, one where your own death was the topic of discussion. Ping, are you there? Ping, I'm getting closer. Ping, I know you're here somewhere. Fluckey and his crew were no longer the investigators, they were the mystery the enemy was trying to solve. They had stumbled from a position of intellectual superiority into the primal, terrifying role of prey. Take her down to 100 feet, Fluckey ordered. All stop. The deck canted slightly as the Barb slipped deeper. The hum of the electric motors died, plunging the submarine into an almost absolute silence. Now, the only sounds were the creaks and groans of the hull settling under the immense pressure and the heartbeat of 80 men thudding in their own ears. The order all stop was the submariner's ultimate gamble. You kill your own noise, curl into a ball on the seafloor, and pray the hunter's sonar mistakes you for a rock. You cease to be a ship and try to become geography. Ping, the sound was sharp, loud, directly overhead. The destroyer was passing right over them. Every man in the boat held his breath, waiting for the one sound that would follow. The chillingly casual sound of a depth charge hitting the water, the metallic plunk that would signal the beginning of the end. The seconds stretched into an eternity. The submarine was a tomb, holding 80 men who had collectively decided to stop breathing. But the sound never came. Instead, the rhythmic pinging resumed. Only this time it was fainter. And the next ping was fainter still. The hunter was moving on, convinced that the silent anomaly on the seafloor was just another lump of cold, indifferent rock. The collective exhale in the Barb was a barely audible whisper. They had survived, but the mission was dead. The coast was actively patrolled. The sensible thing to do was to creep away. But something was wrong. The patrol boat, it was too predictable. This is where the story pivots. Not on a daring act of heroism, but on a quiet moment of intense intellectual scrutiny. The breakthrough came from the most unlikely of sources, the ship's log. Fluckey, a man obsessed with data, had his yeoman bring him the logs from the past 48 hours of coastal observation. He was looking for a detail so mundane it would have been overlooked by anyone else. He was looking at the train schedules. In the dim, crimson light of the conning tower, Fluckey, Wright, and the navigation officer huddled over the logbook. A junior officer had been painstakingly noting the times of every train they had seen. But in his meticulous notes, a pattern began to emerge. There was the 10:45 p.m. northbound freight, the 1:20 a.m. southbound passenger, the 3:00 a.m. mail train, and then nothing until the 5:45 a.m. workers' express. Tonight, the Japanese destroyer had made its patrol run at 2:15 a.m., a full 45 minutes before the mail train was due. That doesn't make sense, Wright muttered, tracing the times with his finger. If you're guarding that track, you don't sweep the area and then leave it unprotected right before a high-value target comes through. You sweep it after. It was a tiny inconsistency, a single note played out of key. But in a high-stakes investigation, tiny inconsistencies are everything. He wasn't guarding the track, Fluckey said, his voice barely a whisper. The excitement was back, but this time it was cold and sharp. He was on a schedule, a rigid, bureaucratic, unthinking schedule. They send a patrol boat down the coast at the same time, every single night, because a man in an office 100 miles away wrote it on a duty roster. This was the breakthrough. Intelligence delivered not by spies or codebreakers, but by the plotting, predictable nature of the enemy's own bureaucracy. The Japanese weren't being clever. They were being lazy. The destroyer wasn't a cunning hunter, it was a glorified night watchman punching a time clock. And that single, exploitable flaw changed everything. They now had a window, a dark, silent gap in the enemy's defenses, precisely between 2:30 a.m., when the patrol boat was safely out of sonar range, and 3:00 a.m., when the next train was due. A 30-minute window of opportunity. Get the landing party ready, Fluckey said. We're going in. Right now? The decision landed in the control room like a live grenade. The relief that had flooded the boat was instantly sucked out, replaced by a tense, heavy silence. The crew had just stared death in the face, and now the skipper was ordering them to walk right back into the lion's den. This time, the conflict turned inward. Lieutenant Commander Bill Wright followed Fluckey into the privacy of the tiny wardroom. The door hissed shut behind them. "Gene, you can't do this," he said, his voice low but firm, stripped of all protocol. "This isn't a calculated risk anymore. It's a suicide mission based on a theory, on a train schedule. What if they change the patrol route tonight? What if there's a second, unscheduled patrol boat? What if the train is early? There are a dozen ways this goes wrong, and every single one of them ends with our men dead or captured and this boat at the bottom of the ocean." This was the uncomfortable truth, laid bare. Fluckey's plan, for all its intellectual brilliance, was still a house of cards, built on the assumption that the Japanese military would behave like a predictable machine. Wright was arguing for the fog of war, the unpredictable chaos that rips apart even the most perfect plans. "We have pushed this boat and this crew to the absolute limit," Wright continued, his fists clenched. "We have been blessed with incredible luck. Let's not spit in God's eye by asking for one miracle too many. My official recommendation, as your XO, is to abort this operation. We take the win, we survived a destroyer, and we get out of here." For a moment, Fluckey's plan was not just an operation, it was an accusation. It flew in the face of the sacred, unspoken pact a commander has with his men that he will not waste their lives. But Fluckey saw a different truth, a more brutal calculation. He saw the coming invasion of Japan, The beaches of Kyushu and Honshu, the hundreds of thousands of American lives that would be spent cracking the shell of the home islands. Your recommendation is noted, Bill, Fluckey said, his voice dangerously quiet. He looked his friend and second-in-command squarely in the eye. Now here's the reality. That train is carrying steel. That steel will be turned into a gun. That gun will be put on a cliff overlooking a beach, and it will kill a 17-year-old Marine from Ohio. Our job is to sink that steel tonight, right here, before it ever becomes a gun. Everything else is noise. It was a stunning rebuke. Fluckey wasn't just dismissing his exos concerns, he was reframing the entire moral equation. The uncomfortable truth he presented was that caution, in this late stage of the war, was the most reckless strategy of all. It was a choice to sacrifice thousands of lives tomorrow to avoid risking 8 tonight. The decision is made, Fluckey said, his voice leaving no room for argument. We're surfacing in 5 minutes. The Barb surfaced with the anemic groan of compressed air forcing water from her ballast tanks. The rebellion that followed wasn't loud or overt. It was a rebellion of silence. The men moved with a grim, resentful efficiency. They prepared the rubber raft, checked the weapons, and passed the demolition charge up through the hatch, but all the eager enthusiasm from hours before was gone. It had been replaced by a quiet, fatalistic dread. They were following orders, but they no longer believed. Bill Wright took his place on the bridge, his face a stone mask. His presence was a constant, silent reproach. The skipper was, for the first time in his command, utterly alone, surrounded by men who were obeying him out of duty, not conviction. The 8 commandos paddled away, disappearing into the oppressive darkness. From the bridge, Fluckey watched the tiny raft vanish, carrying his plan, his career, and the lives of 8 men. He had never felt the weight of command so heavily. The fog of war had rolled in, but it wasn't a fog of confusion, it was a fog of isolation. The timeline was absolute. The raft had left at 0235. The train was due at 0300. The Barb would begin its slow withdrawal at 0255. The raft had to be back alongside by 0310, not 0311. On the bridge, the minutes ticked by with agonizing slowness. 0245 passed. The bomb should be planted. Silence. 0250. Silence. The silence from the shore was no longer a sign of stealth, it was a gaping, terrifying void. At 0255, the moment of truth arrived. Wright turned to him, his face illuminated by the faint red glow of the compass binnacle. "Skipper," he said, his voice flat. "It's time. My recommendation is we get underway." It wasn't a suggestion. It was an execution of the agreed-upon timeline. The order was to leave. Leave them behind. This was the absolute bottom. The lowest point. Fluckey stood on the bridge of the USS Barb, a captain marooned on the island of his own certainty. He had gambled, and the house had won. "One more minute," Fluckey breathed, the words tasting like ash. It was a violation of his own rigid timeline, a desperate, illogical plea. Wright just nodded. The minute crawled by. Nothing. The mission was a failure. The injustice was crushing. He had been so sure. But the fog of war had rolled in and proven him a fool. "All right, Bill," Fluckey said, his voice hollow, defeated. "Take us out. Ahead slow." The order was given. The helmsman repeated it. Deep within the submarine, the electric motors hummed to life, a funeral dirge for the men they were leaving behind. The deck began to vibrate gently. The Barb was moving, turning its back on the shore, on its lost crewmen, on its commander's broken pride. This was it, the irrevocable moment of failure. And then, the world exploded. A flash of incandescent white light erupted from the shoreline, so brilliant it momentarily turned the night into a searing, bleached-out day. It was followed a second later by a deep, gut-punching boom that rolled across the water, a wave of pure sound that rattled the teeth of the men on the bridge. Almost immediately, a second, more chaotic cataclysm of light and noise tore through the first. A string of secondary explosions, a chain reaction of fire and screaming metal, lit up the sky. Fluckey slammed his binoculars to his eyes. He saw it all in perfect, horrifying clarity. The mail train had been precisely on time. The pressure-activated bomb had detonated directly beneath the locomotive's boiler. The resulting explosion was a monster. The engine was lifted from the tracks and thrown through the air like a child's toy. It cartwheeled into the following cars, which were laden not with mail, but with ammunition. They were a string of firecrackers, and the engine was the match. Car after car erupted, sending geysers of fire and shrapnel 1,000 feet into the night sky. The quiet, dark coastline was transformed into a vision of hell. But his triumph was eclipsed by a new, sickening terror. Amid the chaos, he saw them. Silhouetted against the raging inferno, 8 tiny figures were running, sprinting out of the burning woods and onto the beach, directly into the spotlight of their own handiwork. They were alive, but they were exposed. Every Japanese soldier, every sailor, every civilian within 10 miles would now be converging on that single, burning point on the map. The catastrophic success of their mission had become their greatest liability. The explosion was a dinner bell, and every hungry wolf on the coast of Karafuto was now running towards the sound. All engines ahead full. Fluckey roared, "Get us to that raft." Now, the Barb, a creature of the silent deep, was now a speedboat, churning the black water into a phosphorescent wake. It was a brutal violation of every submariner's creed, but Fluckey's men were in the water. All that was left was the primal rule: you do not leave your people behind. The raft was 100 yards out. 50. From the shore came the unmistakable crack, crack, crack of rifle fire. Bullets skipped across the water around the raft. "Get our gun crews on deck," Wright yelled, all his earlier dissent forgotten, replaced by the pure, focused aggression of a warrior. Suppressive fire. Sailors swarmed up from the hatches, manning the deck guns. In seconds, the Barb's guns opened up, sending streams of tracer rounds arcing over the heads of the commandos and into the dark tree line. The submarine was no longer a submarine. It was a gun platform engaged in a close-quarters firefight. The raft slammed against the hull. One by one, the exhausted commandos were hauled aboard. As the last man was pulled onto the deck, he screamed, "Go! Go! They're bringing up mortars. Crash dive!" Fluckey bellowed the second the hatch was sealed. The deafening AOGH of the diving alarm blared as the Barb vented her ballast tanks. Just as the deck slipped beneath the waves, a series of explosions bracketed the submarine, geysers of water erupting a mere 20 yards from the hull. They had escaped by seconds. The boat plunged into the blessed, silent darkness, the crew safe, the impossible mission, impossibly, a success. Years pass. Decades. The roar of the burning train fades into the quiet rustle of archival paper. The USS Barb and her crew become legends, their story a wild footnote in the histories of the Pacific War. The system, the one Fluckey so profoundly challenged, absorbs his success and makes it its own. Then, one day in the late 1990s, a historian is granted access to a newly declassified set of documents from the United States Strategic Bombing Survey. He's not looking for the Barb. He's studying the collapse of the Japanese logistical network in the final months of the war. He's deep in an annex, a series of dry, statistical tables. And there, buried on page 47 of a report titled Analysis of Karafuto Prefecture Industrial Output, July-August 1945, he finds it. A single, sterile line main trunk line, Otomarai-Shikuka sector total line inoperability, July 23rd to August 14th. Followed by a footnote. The historian follows the footnote to a microfilm transcript of an interview conducted in a Tokyo prison in October 1945. The subject is a captured Japanese railway bureaucrat. The man is confused. He's being asked about a single train derailment. Why? The interviewers want to know, did it take so long, a staggering 23 days, to repair one section of track? The bureaucrat, through a translator, explains with a weary air. It wasn't just the track, he says. The Americans must have had a second team, a phantom team, because while all their repair crews were focused on the spectacular wreckage of the train, this other team had apparently used the distraction to demolish a small, insignificant wooden trestle bridge over a ravine, a kilometer north of where the train was hit. But they didn't just blow it up. They did it with such precision that the main supports were shattered, dropping the entire structure into the ravine. It was, he says with a note of professional admiration, a masterpiece of engineering sabotage. The historian sits back from the microfilm reader, the dim light of the archive illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air. He knew the legend of the Barb S train, but the official story always focused on the locomotive. A second team? There was no second team. But then he remembers. He remembers Lieutenant Hatfield, the Eagle Scout, the one who could read terrain in the dark. And he remembers engineman Billy Hatfield, the railroad man, the one who knew tracks, switches, and culverts. The declassified file, the forgotten interview, suddenly unlocks the truth. It vindicates Fluckey's insane gamble in a way no metal ever could. The official story was a decoy. Fluckey's men hadn't just aimed for the train. Billy Hatfield, the railroad man, had used his expert knowledge to place the charge not just under the track, but at the precise spot where the blast from the locomotive's boiler would not only destroy the engine, but also direct its force to shatter the supports of a critical, irreplaceable bridge. The declassified file didn't change the story, it revealed the genius hidden within it. It proved the raid wasn't just a blow, it was a surgical decapitation that crippled the entire island's logistics for weeks. The mission wasn't just about destroying a train. It was about finding the one, hidden, structural weakness in the enemy's system and shattering it with a single, perfectly placed blow. And in that quiet archive, decades after the guns fell silent, the full, breathtaking truth of what happened that night on the coast of Karafuto was finally, and truly, declassified.